cases or something.
What's that?
Maybe some cards.
Yeah. Add a little,
Some sort of altercation.
little interest to it. Yeah. I'm not a producer. Yeah. All right. Our goal tonight is to begin to walk our way through Craig's conceptualization of the theories. And this is kind of a fundamental article in the field these days. And it can be very useful to you. So I'm going to try to make it understandable and applicable for you. But it is a very useful tool. Craig gives us these 7 perspectives, or he groups things into 7 perspectives. And I don't know if any of you have done studies of cognitive processing or whatever, but 7 is apparently, those people who study such things, the largest number of things you can think of at once without breaking it into 2 groups. So I don't know how that works, but that's the case. So your brain, once you get to 8, it starts to break it up. So 7, I know I'm trying to do dice in my mind, and see, but that's the way it goes. So what I want to do is first answer any questions you have, because this was a huge article. I know that some of you didn't get it till just now, but it's a huge article. It introduces you to a landslide of vocabulary and concepts that you may not be familiar with. So that's our job, is to learn to make sense of it. Bob Craig's end goal of all of what he's been doing in communication theory is to get back to the issue of communication scholarship addressing public issues. So if you keep that in mind, you will understand that Bob Craig always wants to push communication back to everyday talk of people about their communication problems. And so we want to look at what people consider to be communication problems. We want to hear how they talk about it. And then we want to take that and ramp it up to theory, and then run it back down to application. So that's where Bob Craig is headed. Bob Craig does have a website up, and he's got all kinds of things up there. He has this PowerPoint that I'm going to walk us through that he presented to the Russian Communication Association in 2006. And it just contains all of the stuff that is part of his perspective. And so we'll walk through that, and then I have his tables up also through internet. I've got his tables up. So we'll go through that language, because the issue of vocabulary is very important. Those of you who have different fields all have particular language that you use to describe what goes on in those fields. So, the theater students, when I first came to this school, one of the first courses I taught was research methods to theater and communication students. So that was crazy, because I was a comm major, but they gave me theater students, and I had to get used to the language of all the theater students. They had a particular set of terms, a particular set of authors that they used, and this all explained what they did. Well, this is what you're getting used to in comm studies now, is the language and the people and the ideas that are going to be part of it. So before I start, do any of you have any thoughts or questions about the article?
I have a question. On the, and I did it wrong in my homework too, it was just making my question. Hold on one second, let me just look. The one where you observe, like, your thought of the world is like through your observations and like
right, that sounds like phenomenology to me. Yeah.
Okay. How is the, like, I understand like what they're saying is like if you your experience is like through, so like if you have a dog and and you love your dog, you have a different idea of what dogs are as opposed to someone who's like bit by one.
Well, that's kind of semiotics, but yeah, okay.
Like my question is, well, I have two. Like one, kind of how are they how do they differentiate?
How does semiotics differentiate from phenomenology, you mean?
Yeah.
Or
Like if you, because what they said is like in semiotics, like how you define a word or how you define, and then how you define a thought.
yeah. Well, semiotics tends to focus a lot on the question of how does a given word or sign come to have meaning. So if you think of it that way in terms of semiotics, it would be, they do overlap. There's no question that they overlap. Different things overlap. Your phenomenology is more of the question of how is the individual experiencing life through language. So it's a slightly different thing. So for instance, in phenomenology, you run into this whole issue of that our perception of the world is structured by the language that we have, which is, there was a person by the name of Gadamer, for instance, who wrote a lot about this. And his argument was that every language is a human creation that embeds prejudices in it. So it has built into it some things that are good and some things that are bad, some things that are regarded this way, some things that are regarded that way. And so when you are born, you come into existence in a language. And so you are already prejudiced towards the world on the basis of the language you come into the world with. So if that language gives you a horizon. You know, here I am, and I'm experiencing the world through the language I have available to me. So there are some things that I see, and some things that I think are good, some things that I think are bad, and there's some things I don't even see because I don't have language that calls my attention to it or makes it something that is a thing I would be thinking about. And then I encounter somebody who speaks another language or has a different experience of life, and our horizons meet. And now all of a sudden, in our relationship, I can begin to see the world. I can begin to, my horizon gets broadened because now I see things through your language and your eyes and your. This is why the study of other languages has, been recommended in liberal arts, and people who know multiple languages have more complexity to be able to perceive the world and think about things.
Would you be able to predict, like based on your knowledge under that tradition, based on your knowledge, like would you take that to situations? Would you be able to predict with that, or is it merely just interpreting afterwards?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, like kind of using okay, like if you have like an experience or if you have a concept of something that you interact with, like a person, right?
Right.
And then every person, like let's take you for an instance, like different people view you differently based on their relationship with you.
Right.
So like, how your family would view you and how we view you as a teacher is different. So if we were to predict, like, if I came up and asked you for $5 versus if your, child came up, it would be a different outcome.
Right.
Would that prediction of how you would react, and would that be under that, or would that be something else? Like,
yeah, in our field, that comes under expectancy violations theory, which is more of a, where does expectancy violations fall? More of a sociocultural view. Whatever. Yeah, phenomenology tries to stay in the area of dialogue and an encounter with other people. So it's the tradition of Martin Buber and I-thou relationships. So it has to do with experience of life. That would come under, for us, an expectancy violation, you know, that this is not the right context for that. So what would we do then? All right, so yeah, any other questions about the chapters?
Just
Jeff?
actually kind of from a critical perspective, just again, Craig's task here, you know, you wonder about, he must have very carefully chosen the 7 because you would imagine that anybody that is a proponent of a theory, that create a theory, they have a dog in the race.
Yes.
So, you know, as neatly as they can make it work out, you know, it may actually, you know, their income will go up or their status will go up in the community.
Right.
So he's, you know, I would imagine he has to look at each of these theories with a little bit of that in mind, that whoever created this is trying to create a world around their idea that will support, you know.
He understands that as a field, when we do next week, when we do theories and scholarship, we'll really go into that idea that people, you know, the way that the academic world works is that people carve out a place for themselves in a given theoretical realm, and then they build on it, right? And so they have a financial interest in it, as well as just a purely intellectual interest in it, right? Craig's background is rhetorical, and if you are thinking of that as you read it, you'll get that feeling that he reflects everything as an issue of public well-being and the way communication affects the public decisions and public life, which is a very rhetorical perspective to take. So, yeah, Craig is kind of in that camp. Right. So let's just walk through some of this, and then we'll get to the tables a little bit. Okay? Communication theory is a field. You can get it on the web. You know, it is up there. Okay, so Craig makes this point in his article that a great deal of what goes as communication theory is very recent. Now, I don't know if anyone picked up why that is the case. Anyone want to reflect on why communication theory as a field is very recent?
You mentioned some, one of the things I just remember was that the explosion of propaganda and,
right.
and you know, World War I.
Right.
Around that time.
Yeah, around the 1900s, there were two things that came together to nurture a strong interest in communication theory. One was the World Wars and the role of propaganda, posters, slogans. People were like, wow, this is really significant. You know, so the whole study of the world wars was an impetus for this. You also had an interest in democracy, which meant that people needed to be equipped to participate in public life and public discourse. So a lot of the early public speaking training was designed around the idea of preparing people to be participants in the political process. Because we had watched fascism, we had watched some other movements.
I was just going to say, maybe one of the other reasons is that it was parts of what is now like communications fell under different fields.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't its own discipline because it was in so many other disciplines.
Yeah, a lot of English departments had kind of the bailiwick of it, and then you had your sociology and psychology thought about communication. But it began to be pulled out through the teachers of speech. The earliest communication association was the Speech Teachers Association. And so you began to get departments formed around it. There was also a movement to study small group process, because there was the realization that groups had the ability to silence people. So we wanted to, there was a strong interest in learning how can groups not get into groupthink or silencing members of the group, but how can people, what is it makes for a good group process instead of an oppressive group process? So there was a kind of a movement, cultural movement in support of communication theory. And as the universities began to be formed, especially some of the larger public universities, there was a struggle to carve out a communication department with its own field. You know, the idea of a field. Craig keeps talking about a field, you know, that an academic field having standing and legitimacy. So psychology was legitimate. Was communication legitimate? Well, what makes you legitimate? Well, you have some theories. So communication, but Craig will talk about communication kind of went around and raided Raiders of the Lost Ark. You know, we raided every other discipline there was and grabbed anything that had to do with communication. From Shannon and Weaver, you know, in telephone repair, we just grabbed all the theories and we put them in our bucket and said we are a field called communication. And but we were just a big mess of different things. All right, so thoughts, questions on that? So this is the field that you're entering, the field of communication studies, and it has a history to it. All right, yeah, so communication became an important category in society. Before that, it was largely, it was all history. Before that, growing power of mass communication. Here's any questions? New professions and industries developed. Now, a lot of these developed in isolation from, you can get this online, by the way. So if you want this PowerPoint, it's on Craig's website. So don't feel like you have to write everything down, unless you want to do that to process the information. New professions and industries often functioned as technical domains rather than as theoretical domains. So that's to say that they created lists of practices to do rather than theorizing about what is going on. So public relations especially was this way, and organizational communication was this way for a long time. Right, and we moved into this time where people said the problem here is a lack of communication, right? You know, so whatever the problem was, communication would solve it. And so we wanted to understand communication. You know, and the goal to some extent too was to avoid solving problems by force and violence. You know, the goal was to somehow use talk to resolve issues so we didn't have the world wars and the consequences of that. Right. So a lot of people by 1950s were interested. Communication research was an interdisciplinary field of social science. Right. So the university is made up of hard sciences. What are the hard sciences? Chemistry, biology, physics are hard sciences. Your social sciences adopt the methodological structure of the hard sciences and do their study of human beings the same way biologists study plants and trees and the same way physicists study planets. You make hypotheses, you have theories, you make tests, you do research, you do quantitative research, you do statistical analysis. So the social sciences borrow the methodologies of the hard sciences for a couple reasons. One is that those methodologies work great in the hard sciences, so we'll try them. But the second is that those methodologies have legitimacy within the academic world. So you get status by using those methods. So you count when you do things scientifically. Now, English folks and humanists are just aghast at that, because they're like, you can't study humans the way you study rocks. You know, it's different. But so that's where you have you have hard science methodologies and humanistic methodologies within the communication studies field. And your phenomenology, your critical traditions are more in the humanistic dimension. Communication theory originates in the 1940s in electrical engineering because it's about radio waves and television waves. So communication theories. So Dr. Bond, who was the chair here for many years, waged an unending war with the rest of the school who wanted to call us communications, the communications department. And he said, no, communications is technology, radio, satellites, is what they do over in the television department. Communication is the study of message exchanges and human behavior in communication. So he always fought for that.
Is it the same in the undergraduate program, or is...
I don't know. Do they call it communications?
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
curious because where I went for my undergrad in College of New Jersey, they called it communications
Yeah, right.
for undergraduate.
Right.
So-
Now, technically, from our point of view, communications is television antennas and radios and things like that, yeah. Whereas communication theory. So that's why when you take your first communication course, you hear about the source, the message, and the receiver, and the medium, and the noise, and all that, which is an electrical engineering theory for explaining radio waves and the transmission of information over phone lines and radio waves. So we snatched that, and if you caught that in Bob Craig's opening, he gets defensive about that in the beginning of the article, because he says there's no reason we shouldn't use that. But people lately had been saying that's not a communication theory. So there's a little bit of struggle about what's in, what's out, what are we going to use, what are we not going to use. So communication theory. Right. Social scientists, again, so that's people studying humans, expanded communication theory to include ideas from cybernetics, social psychology, psychiatry, anthropology, semantics, linguistics, all kinds of fields that they began to draw from. And like Jeff points out, some of this was a frantic quest for institutional legitimacy in protecting your grant money and your budget. So you had to produce stuff to justify yourself. But that's a very cynical look at it, but that nonetheless is part of the story. Right. So now communication is established as an academic discipline. So we have courses, we have textbooks, we have journals, we have conferences, all the things that make you a discipline we have, but it's only recent. Communication theory remains as it was a collection of ideas without unity. So when Lisa studied Griffin's book, Griffin puts about 36 communication theories in his book. But Craig notes that books on communication theory, textbooks, are not consistent in which theories they choose. that there are about 300, almost 300 theories, and this textbook will choose these ones, and this textbook will choose these ones. So it, again, I've said this before, it's not like other fields where there may be 3 or 4 core theories, and you know them, and then you understand. It's like there's 300 theories within the field of communication studies. There's theories about public opinion, there's theories about small group structures, there's theories about interpersonal relationship development, there's theories about mass media. You know, it's just way all over the place. So a collection of ideas without unity, a big bucket with 300 things in it. And so you can teach comm theory in a number of different ways then. We might teach comm theory as interpersonal relationships, you know, or we might be interested in media, or we might be interested in language and semiotics. So, collection. Any thoughts or questions so far? Make sense? So comm theory is a newer term, and it covers a lot of stuff that is not necessarily well organized or connected to each other. So Craig is a leader in the field of communication studies, and his goal of late, in 1999, was to give the field some coherence through what he calls a dialogical and dialectical matrix. So before we hit that, let's go over those 2 words. So let's unpack that phrase. There's a lot of unpacking to do with Craig. I mean, every time I read, I've been reading this article for years, and every time I read it, I see new things in it. So you shouldn't feel bad if you're like, am I supposed to know all this? You know, he's just packed. He wrote this very well, packed full of stuff. So first off, he talks about a matrix. Now, what is, aside from Keanu Reeves and all that stuff, you know, what is a matrix?
Intersection of some kind of ideas.
All right, so it's a place where things come together. It's an intersection. So Craig is going to tell you that he basically is going to work with something like this, you know, and he's going to relate these things to this thing, and they're going to come together at some point. So what Craig wants to do is to create a matrix or some diagrams that are both dialogical and dialectical. All right, so what then would a dialogical part be? If you put 2 things into a dialogical relationship, what are you asking them to do? If I have dialogue with you, what are we trying to do? What's that?
Both ways, those both ways.
Okay, to have interact both ways. Have an exchange that is built on increasing understanding. So the phenomenology of dialogue is that you live in a world with this horizon, I live in a world with this horizon. We want to come together and expand both of our horizons. I want to understand your world, I want you to understand my world. So the dialogical part of it is where each of these different traditions come into dialogue with each other and try to see the world from each other's perspectives. So that's part of what Craig will be after here. Should be a discourse about discourse. So it should be talking about how we talk. So a semiotician should say to a rhetorician, well, this is how I talk about the world. I look for these things. And a rhetorician says, well, okay, I don't look at it that way. I look at the world this way. And so they talk to each other and compare and contrast and open up the difference. So they try to understand each other in points of similarity. And now dialectical, what is dialectics?
It's more of a one-way communication, almost like a lecture.
Okay, well, it could be yeah, okay, I see that, dialectical. It means to speak from two ends. A dialectic is to speak across a divide or a tension. So in a dialectical, we move back and forth in kind of a pull, a tension that we have.